The woods had always been quiet there, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that feels like it's watching you breathe. In the hills of Appalachia, where fog clung to the trees like a warning and sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, there was a place people didn't go. Locals said nothing lived there except shadows and bad blood. And for decades, America listened to that warning without ever asking why. In 1971, something happened that broke the silence. A birth. Not announced, not recorded, not celebrated. A child entered the world deep in those woods, surrounded not by doctors or family smiles, but by secrets so old they had begun to rot. No hospital lights. No birth certificate. Just a cry echoing through trees that had already heard too many. The family responsible barely existed on paper. They had no reason to. Roads passed them by, time forgot them, and the outside world became a rumor they learned to fear. Generations lived and died within the same stretch of land, bound by bloodlines that never branched outward. Names repeated. Faces mirrored each other too closely. And no one asked questions until they had to. When authorities finally stepped into the forest, they didn't find a crime scene. They found a living relic of neglect and isolation. Adults who spoke in fragments. Children who avoided eye contact. And one newborn whose existence raised a question no one wanted to answer. Who was the father? The deeper investigators went, the heavier the air became. This wasn't just a case about poverty or seclusion. It was about what happens when a family disappears into itself for too long, when secrecy becomes survival, and when the outside world chooses not to see. The birth shocked America not because it was sudden, but because it proved something horrifying had been happening all along, hidden in the woods, waiting for someone to finally look. The remote Appalachian forest where the Whitaker family lived was not simply isolated by distance but erased by intention. Tucked deep into uneven hills and dense woodland, the area existed beyond routine travel, beyond curiosity, and beyond concern. Roads thinned into dirt paths and then disappeared entirely, forcing the land itself to become a barrier between the family and the rest of the country. This physical separation allowed generations to pass without meaningful contact with schools, hospitals, churches, or government offices. Over time, isolation became normalized, not as an emergency but as a way of life that no one nearby felt responsible to interrupt. Locals were aware of the land and vaguely aware of the people on it, yet knowledge never translated into action. The forest carried a reputation that discouraged questions. Stories circulated of strange behavior, of people who avoided eye contact and vanished into the trees when approached. Children were rarely seen, and when they were, they looked unkempt, silent, and frightened. Rather than raising alarms, these sightings reinforced a collective decision to keep distance. Fear, discomfort, and social indifference blended into quiet acceptance, allowing the family to remain hidden in plain sight. The lack of official documentation made the family nearly invisible. Births were not registered, deaths went unrecorded, and no consistent names appeared in public records. Without paperwork, there was no trigger for intervention. No school attendance lists flagged missing children. No medical files showed patterns of neglect. No welfare visits were scheduled. The system relied on visibility, and the family's isolation ensured they had none. What should have been warning signs dissolved into administrative silence. Generational isolation compounded the problem. Children grew up knowing only the land, the family, and the rules imposed within it. Outsiders were described as threats, and the outside world was portrayed as hostile or dangerous. This mindset discouraged escape and reinforced obedience. As years passed, isolation stopped being circumstantial and became psychological. The family did not see themselves as hidden, they believed this was simply how life worked. Without comparison or exposure, abnormal conditions felt ordinary. The forest itself played a role, acting as both shield and prison. Thick trees muffled sound, blocked sightlines, and swallowed evidence of daily life. Smoke from fires blended with morning fog. Footprints vanished in mud and leaves. Even law enforcement, when they eventually arrived, struggled to understand how people could live so close to modern America yet remain untouched by it. The land protected secrets by making discovery inconvenient and uncomfortable. This environment allowed patterns to form and repeat without challenge. With no external influence, no education, and no oversight, behaviors passed from one generation to the next unquestioned. Isolation was not just a setting but the foundation upon which everything else was built, ensuring that what happened within the woods stayed there for decades, unseen, unchallenged, and allowed to grow darker over time. Whispers about the family did not begin suddenly, they accumulated slowly, passed from one generation of locals to the next like an unspoken rule. People living on the outskirts of the forest spoke in half-sentences and lowered voices, as if saying too much might invite something unwanted into their lives. Hunters mentioned seeing figures standing unnaturally still between the trees, watching but never approaching. Drivers on nearby backroads recalled shapes crossing the road at dusk and disappearing before headlights could fully reveal them. These sightings were never dramatic enough to demand action, yet they were unsettling enough to linger in memory. The family's behavior reinforced the rumors. Unlike other rural residents who occasionally traveled to town, attended church, or traded goods, these people avoided contact entirely. When encountered, they did not speak in full conversations or respond to basic questions. They seemed unaware of social norms, staring without expression or retreating quickly into the woods. Their silence became a language of its own, signaling that interaction was neither wanted nor safe. Over time, locals learned to interpret this behavior not as a call for help but as a warning to stay away. Children were the most disturbing presence. On rare occasions, they were seen near the tree line, barefoot and poorly clothed, moving cautiously as if they had been trained to hide. Their faces appeared older than their years, marked by confusion rather than curiosity. People noticed similarities among them that went beyond family resemblance, though few dared to articulate what those similarities implied. Instead of confronting the possibility of something deeply wrong, the community chose distance, convincing themselves that interference would only cause trouble. Fear played a central role in maintaining silence. The woods were known for accidents, disappearances, and sudden weather shifts, and the idea of venturing deeper to investigate felt reckless. Some believed the family was violent. Others believed they were cursed or mentally unstable. These beliefs, whether true or not, justified inaction. The unknown was easier to accept than the responsibility of involvement. Rumors created a psychological boundary that was as effective as the physical one formed by the forest. Over time, the whispers became part of local folklore. Children were warned not to wander too far. Teenagers dared each other to walk near the land at night. Adults laughed off stories while still avoiding the area themselves. What began as concern gradually transformed into myth, stripping the family of their humanity and recasting them as something other than people. This shift made it easier to ignore them, easier to pretend they were part of the landscape rather than a family living in distress. By the time authorities would eventually learn the truth, the warnings had existed for years, scattered across conversations and memories. Yet none of them were strong enough on their own to demand action. Each whisper dissolved into the next, forming a quiet agreement that whatever lived in those woods was best left undisturbed. In 1971, the fragile veil of secrecy that had cloaked the Whitaker family for decades began to tear when an anonymous tip arrived at a local law enforcement office. The call was brief, almost hesitant, the voice on the other end trembling with the weight of what they had seen and what they could no longer ignore. Whoever it was had chosen to remain faceless, perhaps fearful of retaliation, perhaps because they understood that the truth they carried was too heavy for ordinary conversation. The tip itself was simple yet horrifying. A child had been born in the forest, one that should not exist under normal circumstances, and the circumstances surrounding this birth were disturbing enough to demand attention. Investigators at first approached the report with skepticism. Anonymous tips were common, and many involved exaggerated claims, drunken ramblings, or local gossip. Yet something in the way the caller described the land, the family, and the child suggested first-hand knowledge. There was precision in the details, the narrow paths winding through the woods, the way the family avoided sunlight, the unusual number of children who appeared undernourished or unwell. The caller's fear lent credibility. It was clear that someone had witnessed events too troubling to ignore, events that had somehow persisted in the shadow of ordinary American life. The tip set in motion a chain of actions that exposed how little the outside world knew about this family. Law enforcement officers, guided by sketchy directions and limited descriptions, ventured into the dense forest, feeling the oppressive quiet press against them. Each step forward was met with caution, because the terrain itself resisted intrusion, and the unknown inhabitants were reputed to respond unpredictably to outsiders. The officers were aware that this was no ordinary welfare check or routine child protection case. Something ancient and hidden was at play, and the very air seemed to confirm it with its stillness and heavy scent of moss and decay. As authorities approached the isolated homestead, the scale of the secrecy became evident. There were no signs of typical life, no mail deliveries, no neighbors stopping by, no clear records connecting this family to schools, hospitals, or local government. The birth the caller had reported was not just unrecorded, it had left no trace in official channels. The realization dawned slowly but clearly: this child had been born completely outside the reach of societal oversight, a fact that was both extraordinary and alarming. The tip had pierced a long-standing silence, exposing a hidden world that most of America had never imagined existed, and forcing authorities to confront a reality that was far more unsettling than any rumor or whispered warning could convey. When authorities finally reached the Whitaker homestead, they were struck by a reality that defied ordinary understanding. The family had lived for generations in isolation so complete that modern society might as well not have existed. The homestead itself was hidden beneath layers of trees, vines, and the natural growth of decades. The buildings were crude but functional, arranged in a way that suggested careful planning for secrecy rather than comfort. There were fences, makeshift barriers, and paths that led deeper into the forest, all designed to allow movement within the property while keeping intruders out. Every aspect of their environment reflected a conscious effort to avoid contact with the outside world. The family members themselves seemed products of the forest, moving with a quiet familiarity among structures that outsiders found confusing and unwelcoming. Their bodies bore the marks of life lived outside medical care: crooked teeth, stunted growth, and other physical traits that hinted at generations of genetic insularity. Clothing was worn, patched, and minimal, indicating a reliance on what could be made by hand or scavenged from the surrounding land. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no access to healthcare, and yet the family had survived for decades in this self-contained ecosystem, sustaining life in a manner that both fascinated and horrified investigators. Attempts to communicate were met with hesitation, fear, or silence. The adults seemed reluctant to acknowledge outsiders, speaking in fragmented sentences, their eyes wary and guarded. Children were even more withdrawn, hiding behind trees, doors, or older family members. Every encounter reinforced the impression that this family had spent their entire existence avoiding detection, learning from each generation how to maintain secrecy while ensuring survival. There was a sense of collective memory encoded in behavior, an instinctual knowledge of how to remain invisible while still sustaining a household in a harsh, isolated environment. Records, when checked, yielded little insight. Birth certificates, medical files, school records, and property documents were either missing, falsified, or non-existent. The family had managed to remove themselves from every system designed to track human life, creating a private world untouched by societal norms or regulations. In effect, they were ghosts to the outside world, living under the radar not by accident but by design. Generations of isolation had become a self-perpetuating cycle. Children learned the rules of secrecy before they could even speak properly, adults enforced boundaries with quiet authority, and the land itself reinforced the family's autonomy. The full weight of this realization struck investigators with a chilling clarity. They were not merely witnessing neglect or poverty, they were confronting a lineage preserved in deliberate isolation, one that had evaded intervention for decades. The family's history, hidden from public view, was encoded in the very land they occupied, in their behaviors, and in the shadows that clung to every corner of their homestead, making it clear that any attempt to understand them would require unraveling decades of secrecy, fear, and calculated avoidance. As investigators spent more time observing the Whitaker family, it became impossible to ignore the physical and cognitive signs that spoke to a long history of inbreeding. Features repeated unnervingly among the family members, facial structures mirrored across generations, slight deformities in limbs, and other physical traits that suggested an unnatural closeness of bloodlines. These were not random occurrences but rather the result of patterns sustained over decades, invisible to the outside world yet painfully evident to anyone paying careful attention. The forest had not only hidden the family from public scrutiny but had allowed genetic anomalies to propagate unchecked, leaving marks on bodies and minds alike. Children, in particular, displayed developmental delays that went beyond mere neglect. Their movements were often awkward, their speech stilted, and their understanding of the world fragmented. Some could not read or write despite being of an age when schooling would normally have been mandatory, while others seemed to struggle with basic reasoning or social interaction. Investigators realized that these cognitive challenges were not solely the result of isolation or poverty. The repetition of familial bloodlines had compounded difficulties, creating a living record of generational genetic strain. Each child was both a product and a witness of a family system that had deliberately avoided genetic diversity, and the results were visible in ways that provoked both scientific curiosity and moral horror. Adults, too, bore the imprints of this insular lineage. While older members seemed to function within the household and manage daily survival, there were consistent markers of health problems and psychological irregularities. Chronic illnesses, unusual behavioral patterns, and a persistent social awkwardness suggested that the effects of inbreeding had accumulated over decades, shaping not only bodies but personalities, emotional regulation, and interpersonal interactions. In many ways, the family's isolation had created a controlled environment in which these traits could persist without outside intervention, reinforcing the patterns and making them almost normal within the context of the household while appearing grotesque or alarming to outsiders. Even more disturbing was the realization that these abnormalities were entirely self-perpetuating. Because the family had limited contact with anyone outside their immediate bloodline, every generation was born into the same cycle, inheriting not only physical traits but also the behaviors, fears, and social limitations imposed by their isolation. The children were neither intentionally harmed nor nurtured in a conventional sense. Instead, they existed in a system where genetic inheritance and environmental deprivation intertwined, producing consequences that no medical intervention or societal oversight had ever interrupted. What became increasingly clear to investigators was that this was not an anomaly caused by chance. It was the result of a carefully maintained pattern, shielded by the forest and reinforced by tradition. The signs were everywhere, in faces, in speech, in learning ability, and in health. And the deeper authorities looked, the more they understood that they were witnessing the long-term consequences of a family deliberately removed from the checks and balances of society, living as if hidden in a world of their own making. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Whitaker case was the question of paternity, a mystery so unsettling that it haunted every investigation and whispered through every account of the family's life. From the moment authorities first encountered the child whose birth had been anonymously reported, the question arose: who was the father? Unlike typical cases where documentation, witnesses, or even casual observation could provide clarity, here there was nothing. The family's generational isolation meant that outside relationships were virtually non-existent, and the repeated patterns of insular reproduction suggested that the answer might lie entirely within the family itself. Every possibility carried implications that were both tragic and horrifying, forcing investigators to consider realities most would never imagine. The child's existence highlighted the unnerving reality of a family bound so tightly by blood that conventional social boundaries had dissolved. In the absence of external genetic input, every pregnancy carried the weight of inherited traits from closely related individuals, creating a closed system where the distinction between father, uncle, brother, and cousin became dangerously blurred. The adults in the household operated under unspoken rules, shaped by decades of isolation, that dictated both behavior and reproduction. These rules were reinforced through fear, obedience, and the normalization of practices that society would label as taboo. The question of the child's father was not merely biological but psychological and cultural, intertwined with the family's long-standing hierarchy and methods of control. Investigators faced challenges in attempting to unravel the mystery. Standard methods of determining paternity, medical records, birth certificates, and routine interviews were unavailable. Family members were reticent, either out of fear or a learned instinct to protect secrets, and the dense forest that had long concealed the household now seemed to protect their history as well. The adults provided fragmented stories, sometimes contradicting each other, and children were too young or too conditioned by isolation to offer reliable accounts. Even visual observation proved misleading, as repeated familial features made distinguishing relationships difficult. Every answer seemed to raise more questions, deepening the sense of unease surrounding the household. The implications of this mystery extended beyond the individual child. It underscored the generational patterns that had allowed the family to survive but also perpetuated physical and cognitive abnormalities. Each pregnancy reinforced the closed system, amplifying the effects of inbreeding and making the question of paternity a reflection of a broader, darker reality. The family's structure itself was both the source of their survival and the origin of their most horrifying traits. In this way, the identity of the father became a symbol of the secrets that had been carefully preserved for decades, a question that could not be answered without confronting the full scope of what had been hidden within the woods, where silence had long reigned. As authorities delved deeper into the Whitaker family's world, it became painfully clear that fear governed every aspect of their existence. The family's avoidance of outsiders was not simply a habit but a survival mechanism, cultivated over generations and reinforced by a profound mistrust of the outside world. Each adult seemed to carry an inherited knowledge of danger, teaching children from birth to retreat at the first sign of a stranger. This instinctual caution extended to every interaction. Eyes would dart to the forest edge at the slightest sound, doors remained firmly closed, and voices were kept to a whisper or not used at all. Investigators quickly realized that any attempt to question or intervene would be met with silence, deflection, or subtle hostility, a fact that made the case extraordinarily difficult to unravel. The family's fear was rooted in experience as much as imagination. Decades of living beyond the reach of societal oversight had created an environment in which any contact with outsiders could be perceived as threatening. The notion of authorities, medical professionals, or even curious neighbors entering the forest was terrifying, not just for the adults but for the children who had grown up absorbing the lessons of secrecy and self-preservation. Obedience was enforced quietly but rigorously, through intimidation, punishment, or the implicit understanding that deviation could bring calamity. The family's isolation had taught them that exposure could lead to harm, and so the walls of the forest became both a refuge and a prison, designed to keep the world at bay. This pervasive fear had significant consequences for the investigation. Traditional methods of eliciting information, interviews, observation, casual questioning, were largely ineffective. Family members would provide only fragments of information, often contradictory, and sometimes they refused to speak at all. Children were particularly difficult to engage, their responses filtered through years of taught caution. Investigators could sense the invisible boundaries the family had created, a line that could not be crossed without triggering anxiety, retreat, or outright resistance. The forest itself reinforced these boundaries, its density and complexity providing cover and a sense of control for the family, making intrusion both physically and psychologically challenging. Even when confronted with evidence of wrongdoing or neglect, the family's response was not denial in the traditional sense but a carefully constructed silence. Questions about births, health, or lineage were met with evasive answers, nonverbal cues, or avoidance. Fear operated as both a shield and a tool of control, maintaining secrecy and preventing understanding. The family's instinct to protect itself at all costs made it nearly impossible to establish clarity, leaving investigators to navigate a labyrinth of omissions, half-truths, and the ever-present weight of generational terror. In this way, the fear that permeated the household did more than protect the family, it shaped their reality, dictated their behavior, and ensured that the world outside the forest remained at a distance, struggling to comprehend a story that had been hidden for decades. When news of the Whitaker family finally reached the broader public, the story ignited a shockwave that few could have anticipated. Media outlets across the nation seized on the case, framing it as a horrifying anomaly, a glimpse into a world most Americans assumed no longer existed. Headlines hinted at unspeakable secrets, obscure lineages, and the grotesque consequences of generations removed from society. The idea that a child could be born completely hidden from legal and medical oversight, nurtured in isolation, and shaped by inbreeding captivated a public both morbidly curious and profoundly disturbed. The coverage forced the nation to confront the uncomfortable reality that even within a country as connected as the United States, some families could exist entirely beyond scrutiny. Public reaction was intense and polarized. Many people expressed disbelief, struggling to reconcile the horror of the situation with the image of a modern, regulated society. Letters poured into local newspapers, talk shows debated morality and oversight, and law enforcement agencies were suddenly inundated with inquiries and speculation. Yet beneath the shock, there was also a sense of guilt and unease. Communities realized that whispers, rumors, and subtle signs had been ignored for years. Neighbors who had passed the family on backroads, hunters who had glimpsed figures in the trees, and local residents who had whispered about strange sounds or missing children all recognized that they had seen pieces of the truth and chosen not to act. The exposure made it clear that the country had been looking away, letting an extraordinary and troubling situation persist unnoticed. For authorities, the national attention created additional pressure. Investigators had to navigate a landscape where every step could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or sensationalized. The family, already fearful of outsiders, became even more wary, understanding that their world had been breached in ways they could neither predict nor control. Media narratives often simplified or exaggerated elements, turning complex human behaviors into symbols of horror, but the underlying reality remained unchanged. A multi-generational family had lived isolated and hidden, and the consequences of that isolation had manifested in ways that society was only beginning to comprehend. The publicity also sparked broader conversations about the role of social services, law enforcement, and community responsibility. Experts debated whether systemic failures had allowed the family to remain hidden for so long, while ordinary citizens struggled with the notion that ignorance and fear had enabled secrecy to flourish. The Whitaker case became more than a single story. It was a mirror reflecting societal blind spots and the consequences of willful indifference. Suddenly, what had been a secluded forest in Appalachia became a national symbol of isolation, neglect, and the fragility of social oversight, forcing Americans to reckon with the idea that some horrors, no matter how well hidden, can ripple far beyond the boundaries of the woods where they originate. Even after authorities intervened, countless questions about the Whitaker family remained unresolved, leaving a lingering sense of unease that no report or news article could fully dispel. The forest had long protected not just the family but their secrets, and exposure did not suddenly untangle decades of hidden lives. Investigators could document births, identify individuals, and trace some patterns of behavior, yet the deeper truths, the motivations, the precise nature of relationships, and the psychological toll of isolation remained obscured. Every answer uncovered seemed to reveal more complexity, more layers of secrecy, reinforcing the idea that some aspects of human experience resist explanation, especially when cultivated in deliberate isolation over generations. Even with official oversight, the family continued to operate according to the rules they had inherited, often resisting attempts at integration or intervention. Children struggled to adjust to the presence of outsiders, exhibiting behaviors shaped by decades of confinement and mistrust. Adults, too, retained a wary vigilance, observing every interaction with a measured caution that reflected not only fear but the instinctive knowledge that their survival had always depended on secrecy. This resistance complicated efforts to understand the full extent of what had transpired within the household, leaving investigators and social workers to piece together fragments of a story that had been carefully concealed. The psychological impact on both the family and those who entered their world was profound. For the children, exposure to the outside world introduced confusion, fear, and a sense of displacement. For authorities, media personnel, and even local residents, the experience of encountering a family whose life had unfolded entirely outside societal norms was unsettling in ways that went beyond legal or procedural concerns. Observing the lingering effects of isolation, genetic issues, and intergenerational secrecy forced a confrontation with questions about morality, responsibility, and the limits of intervention. It became clear that rescuing individuals from physical isolation did not automatically resolve the invisible networks of trauma and conditioning that had been nurtured over decades. Moreover, the Whitaker case continued to provoke broader reflection on societal negligence. How had such a family remained unnoticed for so long? How many other hidden lives existed in places overlooked by social services or dismissed by neighbors as unremarkable? The answers were incomplete, and in many ways, unknowable. The child whose birth had sparked the investigation symbolized both the horror of what had been hidden and the enduring mystery that remained. Though exposure brought national attention and prompted intervention, it could not erase the years of secrecy, the patterns of isolation, or the genetic and psychological consequences that had been allowed to persist. Ultimately, the story of the Whitaker family became a cautionary tale about the limits of oversight, the power of isolation, and the enduring weight of secrets. Even decades later, the questions linger, haunting those who study the case and leaving a shadow over the Appalachian forest where the family's hidden world once thrived, a reminder that some truths, once concealed, resist closure and continue to unsettle long after discovery.